4:31 a.m. Korea Standard Time. The demilitarized zone at this hour is a 250-kilometer strip of silence, 4 kilometers wide, the most heavily instrumented border on the planet, monitored by ground sensors, satellite passes, UAV coverage, and forward observation posts that have been manned continuously for 70 years. None of that instrumentation prevented what happened at 4:31 a.m. The Korean People's Army had been preparing this launch sequence inside mountain tunnels for 11 months. Tunnel systems do not radiate heat. Tunnel systems do not produce satellite visible signatures. The preparation for the most significant artillery and ballistic missile operation since the Korean War had been conducted almost entirely underground and almost entirely invisible. At 4:31 a.m., the tunnels opened. From 41 separate positions along the northern face of the DMZ, positions that US and ROK intelligence had cataloged, assessed, and in some cases tracked for years, 170mm Koksan self-propelled artillery pieces emerged on pre-calculated firing lines. The Koksan had a maximum range of approximately 60 kilometers. Seoul's northern suburbs were 48 kilometers from the nearest KPA artillery positions. The Koksan's first salvo was not directed at central Seoul. It was directed at the U.S. Forces Korea Base Complex at Camp Humphreys, at Osan Air Base, and at the ROK Army Forward Command infrastructure in Gyeonggi Province. Military targets. Assessed military targets. Hundreds of artillery rounds per minute from 41 firing positions arriving simultaneously. The artillery was the distraction. From pre-surveyed positions in North Hwanghae and South Chungcheong Provinces, positions inside mountain valleys whose overhead cover had defeated 3 separate attempts at preemptive targeting over the preceding 4 years. 340, Hwasong 7 and KN-23. Theater ballistic missiles achieved launch status between 4:31 a.m. and 4:33 a.m. in a staggered sequence designed to saturate the intercept timeline. The Hwasong 7 had a range of approximately 1,000 kilometers and a CEP measured in hundreds of meters. Not a precision instrument, but a volume weapon. The KN-23, by contrast, was a maneuvering system. Its terminal phase replicated characteristics of the Russian Iskander. Its accuracy was measured in tens of meters. 47 KN-23s were in that launch sequence. Among the 47 KN-23s, 3 carried payloads that the USDIA had assessed with high confidence as tactical nuclear devices. Not strategic. Tactical. Yields estimated between 10 and 20 kilotons. Targeted not at cities. Targeted at Camp Humphreys, at Osan, and at the U.S. carrier group operating in the Yellow Sea. The KPA had not launched a nuclear device in the Korean theater before. This was the threshold they had chosen to cross. Their internal assessment, reconstructed later through intercepted communications and the forensic analysis of their targeting selections, held that tactical nuclear use against military targets would demonstrate resolve without triggering a strategic U.S. nuclear response. They had studied the U.S. nuclear employment doctrine carefully and identified what they assessed as a gap between strategic deterrence and tactical use in a theater conflict. They believed that gap was exploitable. They believed the political paralysis that a tactical nuclear launch would generate in Washington would delay the conventional response by 12 to 24 hours. That delay, in their assessment, was sufficient to achieve their primary objective: the destruction of U.S. forward basing in South Korea, sufficient to make a sustained U.S. conventional air campaign operationally untenable. The flaw in that calculation was the assumption of political paralysis. The U.S. Delegation Authority for Theater Ballistic Missile Defense Engagement did not require a presidential decision. It required a USFK commander authorization. That authorization had been pre-delegated. It had been issued at 4:19 a.m., 12 minutes before the first KPA launch, when satellite indicators triggered a pre-launch alert that placed every U.S. defensive system in the Korean theater at maximum readiness. The defense was already running when the first missile cleared the tunnel mouth. 4:31 a.m. The AN/TPY-2 forward-based radar deployed at South had been tracking the launch signature anomalies in North Hwanghae Province since 4:24 a.m. The radar operator, a staff sergeant with 6 years of THAAD operations experience, had logged 2 previous false positive events in this sector in the preceding 18 months. At 4:31 a.m., the signatures on his display were not ambiguous. 14 simultaneous launch plumes. Then 9 more. Then 23 more across 3 separate sectors. His log entry at 4:31 a.m. read, "Confirmed mass launch event, ballistic class, multiple threat axes." He transmitted on the primary and backup net simultaneously. Acknowledgement from the THAAD Fire Control Center arrived in 4.1 seconds. Engagement authorization had been pre-delegated. The system was already tracking. It began allocating interceptors before the acknowledgement had finished transmitting. The 3 KN-23 tracks carrying the assessed nuclear payloads were designated Priority 1 through Priority 3 by the Engagement Management System within the first 90 seconds of launch detection. Every available interceptor in the theater was nominally assigned to those 3 tracks before any other engagement decision was made. The remainder of the launch sequence would be addressed by the layered architecture. The 3 priority tracks would be addressed by everything simultaneously available. Priority 1, the KN-23 targeting Camp Humphreys, was engaged by SM-3 Block 2A from a U.S. Navy Aegis destroyer operating in the Yellow Sea at 4:38 a.m. Clean mid-course intercept. The track disappeared from the engagement display. No further engagement required. Priority 2. The KN-23 targeting Koksan executed a terminal maneuver at 4:39 a.m. that the SM-3 intercept vehicle could not compensate for within its available correction envelope. The SM-3 achieved proximity detonation parameters but off-axis, insufficient. The track continued. They had engaged at 4:40 a.m. The intercept vehicle achieved a direct hit at 38,000 feet. The KN-23's payload was neutralized at altitude over South Chungcheong Province, 64 kilometers south of Koksan. Debris impact in uninhabited terrain. Priority 3, the KN-23 targeting the carrier group in the Yellow Sea, was engaged by SM-3 at 4:38 a.m. and SM-6 at 4:40 a.m. in sequence. The second engagement following the first's off-axis result within 8 seconds of the miss confirmation. The SM-6 intercept confirmed at 4:41 a.m. at 12,000 meters altitude, 94 kilometers from the carrier. All 3 assessed nuclear payload KN-23s were neutralized before reaching their targets. The remaining 337 ballistic tracks, 293 Hwasong-7 and 44 standard KN-23, were processed by the layered intercept architecture at its maximum engagement rate. THAAD handled the high-altitude Hwasong-7 engagements. PAC-3 managed terminal phase tracks. Aegis BMD contributed from the Yellow Sea and from pre-positioned USS positioned along the east coast of the peninsula. The architecture was performing at its designed maximum. But the architecture had not been designed for 340 simultaneous ballistic tracks. The THAAD battery at South expended its full ready load at 4:44 a.m. 32 interceptors, 32 engagements, 32 confirmed neutralizations or assessed high-probability intercepts. Then it was empty. The reload cycle for a THAAD battery requires approximately 45 minutes under field conditions. 45 minutes during which those tracks could only be addressed by lower-tier systems. The PAC-3 batteries absorbed the additional load. They were not designed to handle Hwasong-7 ballistic tracks at the altitudes THAAD would normally address. They were handling them now because THAAD was reloading. The engagement geometry was degraded. The intercept probability per engagement dropped from the THAAD range figure of approximately 93% to the PAC-3 against high ballistic figure of approximately 71%. The math of 71% intercept probability applied across 94 tracks during that 45-minute reload window produced a statistical outcome. 12 Hwasong-7 warheads reached their target areas. 12 ballistic warheads impacting pre-surveyed military coordinates across Gyeonggi Province and the northern approaches to the Han River line. The warheads were not nuclear. They were conventional, high-explosive. The impacts produced significant structural damage to Camp Humphreys' eastern logistics compound, rendered 11 aircraft at Osan non-operational inside hardened revetments that were not hardened to the required standard for this threat category, and severed 3 road arteries used for U.S. military resupply movements south of the DMZ. These were real effects on real infrastructure. They were not strategic defeats. Osan retained runway operational capability. Camp Humphreys retained command and communications function. The carrier group in the Yellow Sea was intact and had maintained continuous flight operations throughout the ballistic missile engagement phase. The Koksan artillery barrage was addressed through a different system entirely. Counter-battery radar, AN/TPQ-53 firefinder units positioned at 6 sites along the ROK forward line had been tracking the Koksan firing signature since the first rounds departed their tubes at 4:31 a.m. Each round fired by a Koksan artillery piece generates a trackable radar signature. The firefinder system requires 4 rounds to establish a firing position solution with sufficient confidence for counter-battery engagement. The first Koksan battery in Sector 7 had fired its 4th round by 4:31 a.m. and 43 seconds. The counter-battery solution was transmitted to M270 multiple-launch rocket system batteries positioned at pre-surveyed firing sites along the ROK rear area at 4:32 a.m. The first MLRS salvos impacted Koksan firing positions beginning at 4:34 a.m., 3 minutes after the first KPA artillery round. The counter-battery mission was not designed to silence the Koksan barrage immediately. It was designed to degrade the Koksan firing rate by forcing position changes, disrupting crew operations, and systematically reducing the number of operational tubes. Each Koksan battery that received accurate counter-battery fire had a choice: remain in position and continue firing while taking losses, or relocate under the counter-battery suppression and lose its firing timeline. The KPA had trained for this decision. 23 of 41 batteries chose to relocate. 18 continued firing. The 18 that continued firing continued receiving counter-battery MLRS rounds. By 4:52 a.m., 21 minutes after the barrage began, 12 of the 18 had been assessed as operationally suppressed or significantly degraded. 6 continued firing at reduced rate. The barrage that had been delivering several hundred rounds per minute at 4:31 a.m. was delivering fewer than 60 rounds per minute by 4:52 a.m. Those 60 rounds per minute were still impacting military infrastructure in Gyeonggi Province. Suppressed was not the same as silenced. The Koksan problem was not solved in 21 minutes. It would require sustained counter-battery operations, air-delivered precision engagement of the remaining positions, and in some cases the direct engagement of re-entrant tunnel positions that the counter-battery radar could not address with MLRS alone. This was the operational reality of the Korean theater that made it categorically different from the Iran or Pacific scenarios. The KPA's primary mass fires capability was not a missile inventory that could be reduced through a single precision engagement cycle. It was tens of thousands of artillery tubes, the majority in hardened positions, distributed across 250 kilometers of mountainous terrain, many of them inside blast-resistant tunnels that required direct entry to engage. The 60-minute decisive conclusion was not the appropriate framework for this theater. The first 60 minutes were about absorbing the initial strike and establishing the conditions for a sustained campaign. 4:43 a.m. The Combined Forces Command had issued the Counter-Operation Execute Order at 4:39 a.m., 8 minutes into the KPA launch sequence before the ballistic missile engagement phase was complete. The strike package priorities were established by a target list that U.S. Forces Korea had been maintaining and updating for 22 years. The priority sequence was not the Koksan artillery. Those were being addressed by counter-battery fire. The priority sequence was the KPA's second launch capability, the TEL units holding the reserve ballistic inventory that could generate a second wave if the first wave's effects fell short of the KPA's campaign objectives. EF-35. A aircraft operating from Kunsan Air Base, which had been on 5-minute alert status since 4:19 a.m., were airborne by 4:35 a.m. with assigned strike packages targeting pre-surveyed TEL storage positions in North Hwanghae Province. The flight time to the nearest target sets was 18 minutes. They would be over their targets at 4:53 a.m. B-1B Lancer aircraft that had been holding airborne alert 600 kilometers east of the peninsula since 2 a.m. received their strike packages at 4:40 a.m. JASSM-ER releases against KPA missile maintenance and logistics facilities were executed beginning at 4:47 a.m. 41 weapons in flight simultaneously toward pre-surveyed targets across South Pyongan and North Hwanghae provinces. Each weapon valued at $1.36 million. 41 simultaneous releases represented $55.8 million of precision ordnance in flight from a single aircraft's weapons bay in under 90 seconds. The B-2 Spirit aircraft that had departed Whiteman Air Force Base 18 hours earlier and had been holding at altitude over the Sea of Japan since 3:40 a.m. received their targeting packages at 4:41 a.m. Their assigned targets were the hardest in the Korean target set, KPA command bunkers in the Myeohyang Mountain Complex, the underground missile assembly facilities assessed to be at depths exceeding 70 meters of granite and reinforced concrete, and 2 tunnel complexes in North Hwanghae Province that imagery analysis had assessed as active ICBM storage and maintenance sites. These targets required the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator. No other weapon in the U.S. inventory had a reasonable probability of achieving structural defeat against them. The first GBU-57 impact occurred at 5:04 a.m. against the Myeohyang Mountain Command Bunker, a facility assessed at 80 meters depth under granite, the primary wartime command node for KPA rocket forces in the western operational area. The seismograph at the ROK Geological Survey Station in Gangwon Province registered a 2.3 magnitude event at 5:04 a.m. and 11 seconds. The facility's operational status post-impact was assessed as probable non-functional pending imagery confirmation. Probable, not confirmed. Hardened mountain facilities presented a battle damage assessment challenge that precision flat terrain targets did not. The B-2 crew logged the release, received the seismic event data via satellite link, and turned to their second target. By 5:10 a.m., the United States had expended $1.3 billion in precision munitions against KPA military targets since the execute order. The F-35 sensor-to-shooter pairs were now over their TEL target sets in North Hwanghae. The Koksan counter-battery mission was on its 48th minute of continuous operation. The 3 priority nuclear payload tracks had been neutralized. The THAAD battery was 9 minutes from reload completion. The KPA's desperation sequence activated at 4:58 a.m. The KPA missile forces had held back a reserve of 22 Hwasong 15 intermediate-range ballistic missiles, not for the Japanese archipelago, not for Guam, but for a specific target set that their operational planners had assessed as the center of gravity for U.S. response capability in the theater: the Aegis BMD ships in the Yellow Sea and the Sea of Japan. Without those ships, THAAD was the only remaining high-tier intercept capability in the theater. Without THAAD and Aegis simultaneously, A third KPA salvo could overwhelm the PAC-3 terminal layer. The Hwasong-15 reserve was the instrument for that sequencing. 22 Hwasong-15 launches from dispersed mountain positions in Chungcheong Province were detected at 4:58 a.m. The tracks were assessed as targeting the Yellow Sea and Sea of Japan Aegis positions within 90 seconds of launch detection. The Aegis ships had been prepared for this contingency. The Yellow Sea destroyer repositioned at 4:51 a.m. based on a probabilistic threat axis assessment, a 7 nautical mile movement that placed it outside the highest probability targeting corridor for Chungcheong Province launches. The repositioning was a standard tactic. It reduced the engagement probability of any inbound that had been targeted on the ship's 4:45 a.m. position. 15 of the 22 Hwasong-15S were engaged by SM-3 in mid-course phase. 5 were engaged by SM-6 in terminal phase. 2 entered their terminal descent phases with no available intercept solution in the immediate engagement queue. The Aegis engagement cycle had reached its processing limit during the simultaneous mid-course and terminal phase management of the 22-track salvo. The first of the 2 residual tracks impacted the ocean at 5:08 a.m. It had been targeted on the destroyer's 4:45 a.m. position. The repositioning had taken it outside the lethal radius by 6.4 nautical miles. The impact generated a significant water column and was recorded by every seismic station in the region. The second residual track impacted the ocean 1.2 nautical miles from the destroyer at 5:09 a.m. The proximity fuse did not function at the impact angle. The ship's bridge watch reported the water column on the port quarter at approximately 2,200 meters distance. It was the closest a KPA ballistic weapon had come to a U.S. surface combatant in the history of the alliance. The ship was undamaged. The crew was not. The KPA had expended its reserve. The Aegis platforms were intact. The THOAD battery completed its reload at 5:15 a.m. The theater ballistic missile defense architecture was restored to full capacity at maximum alert. At 5:18 a.m., the KPA Air Defense Command transmitted its last coherent network status message to field units. The message reported communications relay in South Pyongan offline. Rocket forces TEL positions in North Hwanghae non-responsive. Artillery sectors 3, 7, 11, 14, and 19 reporting operational degradation. After 5:18 a.m., the command network continued operating. Degraded, fragmented, operating on backup protocols that reduced throughput to 15% of nominal capacity. This was not the adversary's silence as a concluded event. It was the adversary's silence as a progressive condition. The KPA's communications infrastructure had been constructed with deliberate redundancy, precisely because its planners had studied what U.S. electronic warfare and precision engagement did to centralized command networks. The degradation was real. It was not terminal. At 5:18 a.m., surviving KPA artillery batteries in sectors 4, 8, and 22 were still receiving some fire mission coordination, at a rate and accuracy far below their pre-launch capability, but receiving it. This was the reality that separated the Korean theater from every other scenario in this framework. The adversary did not stop. The adversary slowed. The adversary's command and control degraded toward non-coherence on a timeline measured in hours, not minutes. The 60-minute window was not the end of the campaign. It was the end of the beginning. The watch officer at Combined Forces Command updated the operational status board at 5:20 a.m. The board showed 3 priority nuclear tracks neutralized, 328 of 340 ballistic tracks engaged with assessed intercept or neutralization, 12 ballistic warheads with confirmed effects on military infrastructure. Koksan barrage suppressed to 11% of initial rate. KPA TEL reserve in North Hwanghae, approximately 60% addressed through F-35 sensor-to-shooter and JASSM-ER first cycle. B2 deep target engagements ongoing. Aid reloaded and operational. He flagged 3 items for immediate command attention. First, the PAC-3 ready load across all Korean theater batteries was at 41%. Resupply from pre-positioned stocks would require 12 hours minimum. Second, the Koksan batteries in re-entrant tunnel positions, 9 confirmed positions that counter-battery MLRS could not address without a direct line-of-sight engagement solution, required air-delivered precision munitions that were not available in theater quantity for simultaneous engagement. Third, battle damage assessment on the B-2 deep target strikes was preliminary. Probable non-functional assessments were not confirmed neutralizations. The Myeohyang Mountain facility might be intact. The 3 flagged items were not operational failures. They were the parameters of the campaign that would follow. 41% PAC-3 capacity was 41% of a system that had just intercepted the majority of 340 simultaneous ballistic tracks. Probable non-functional was a reasonable assessment outcome against targets at 80 meters depth in granite. The 9 Koksan tunnel positions were the hardest target category on the Korean peninsula and had been assessed as such for 15 years. The board was not a victory display. It was a campaign status update. Time from first launch detection to end of initial engagement phase, 49 minutes. Adversary weapons employed, 340 theater ballistic missiles, 293 Hwasong-7, 44 standard KN-23, 3 KN-23 assessed nuclear payload, 22 Hwasong-15 intermediate-range ballistic missiles, reserve salvo. Koksan artillery barrage, estimated 4,200 rounds delivered over 49-minute suppression window. Ballistic intercept rate, first wave, 96.5%. 3 priority nuclear tracks, 100%. Ballistic intercept rate, Hwasong-15 reserve, 90.9%, 20 of 22 neutralized. Combined ballistic intercept rate, 94.4%. Effects from non-intercepted ballistic weapons. 12 Hwasong-7 warheads with confirmed effects on US and ROK military infrastructure. 0 nuclear detonations. 0 US or ROK population centers affected. Koksan artillery effects. Significant structural damage to Camp Humphreys Eastern Logistics Compound. 11 aircraft at Osan. 3 road arteries south of DMZ. Barrage suppressed to 11% of initial rate by end of 49-minute window. 9 firing positions in re-entrant tunnel positions remaining active. Counter-operation first cycle. 41 JASSM-ER against TEL, reserve positions. 12 GBU-57 MOP against deep hardened facilities. Continuous MLRS counter-battery against Koksan firing positions. F-35 sensor-to-shooter against mobile TEL units. 41% of North Hwanghae TL reserve assessed operationally degraded. U.S. assets, THAAD battery expended and reloaded. 45-minute reduced capacity window during reload. PAC-3 ready load at 41% across theater. 1 destroyer at closest ballistic proximity event in Alliance history, undamaged. 11 aircraft at Osan rendered non-operational. Camp Humphreys logistics compound significant structural damage. Personnel, 14 confirmed injuries from ballistic effects on military installations, all in treatment. The KPA had expended their first-wave ballistic inventory and their intermediate-range reserve. They had achieved measurable effects on U.S. forward-basing infrastructure. They had not achieved the runway denial they required to make sustained U.S. air operations untenable. They had not achieved a nuclear detonation on any target. They had not neutralized an Aegis platform. They had not generated the 12 to 24-hour political delay their planners had assessed as achievable. The campaign was not over. Both parties understood this. The first 49 minutes had established one parameter with clarity: the gap between what the KPA had prepared for decades to execute and what they had actually achieved was the width of 7 decades of US and ROK investment in layered theater defense. That gap had been tested under full operational conditions for the first time. The defense had held, at cost, with real effects on real infrastructure, at 41% PAC-3 capacity and an ongoing Koksan suppression problem that would consume operational attention for the next 72 hours. It had held. That was the number. Not the exchange ratio, not the dollar figures, not the damage assessment percentages. The nuclear devices had not reached their targets. The carriers were operational. The runways were operational. The command networks were operational. The rest was a campaign. It would be long, costly, and without a clean conclusion in under an hour. It had been designed that way for 70 years.